I believe we're transmitting already. So, good afternoon, everybody. Today's our last meeting and saving the best for last. We have here, it's a joy to have here at the university, so not online, Professor Allison. We also have Professor Ramon. And we're going to talk today about SBIE and about the calculation of the top-up tax. So it's a pleasure to have you both here. So it's a pleasure to have you here. You just arrived in São Paulo and you're already lecturing a class. So this is amazing. Thank you very much, Shweti. I guess please do the introduction and.
Just I just tell you why Allison's here, because you learn once that you should even always be quiet. Don't open your mouth, because when you open your mouth, there are people hearing you. Imagine last year we had the Congress on International Tax Law, and we invited Professor Alison Christians to the Congress. And then she arrived just with the whole energy you're going to see she has. And we were having lunch by that time. We were in this other building we have there. And she said, "This is beautiful. I would love to teach in such a building." I said, would you? He said, "Yes." I said, "Well, done." And the dean was there also. So I introduced Alison to the dean and said, "Well, Alison wants to teach here," and everything was arranged. So Alison is going to stay with us for the whole semester. She's coming today. She's leaving only on June. She's offering international tax law, both in mornings and I'm not saying evenings, I'm saying nights, because the last one from 9:30 to 11 p.m. That's what she's doing. She's also teaching in our postgrad course that we're doing together, Trends on International Taxation. And also she's most probably teaching in IBDT. I don't know whether you see. Yes, most probably also in IBDT. So that's the idea. She has lots to do here, but of course researching and so on. Oh, she's going to have a life here. And I hope you all will have the pleasure of knowing why we invited Alison. Not necessarily because we agree, because that's the most important. The idea is also to discuss a bit in some issues. It's going to be nice for all of you. Alison, so glad. Please make your show. You're going to see what I mean by this.
You don't want to start? You don't have words to start with?
No, it's teaching after you.
Okay. So, boa tarde. I think, is it night yet? Okay, good. Sorry, desculpe, eu não falo português.
Yes.
That's what I know so far. But I also have been learning with Duolingo. So I can tell you that Mina gato now come pau. I don't know why I would need to know this phrase, but this is what Duolingo has taught me. I don't actually have a cat. But if I had one, it would definitely not eat bread, apparently. Okay. But I will learn some Portuguese, I hope, while I'm with you. So the topic SBIE, before we get into the details of that, let me ask just a kind of framing question, see where we are. Because you have been studying GLOBE and the Pillar 2 for some time now, yeah? For several weeks, right? 2 weeks, okay. So you have this idea.
24 hours.
24. Oh, wow. That's perfect. 24 hours of GLOBE. That's like a world tour of GLOBE. That's very nice. That's good. And so much has happened in the last 3 weeks with the US, doing interesting things vis-a-vis the OECD, vis-a-vis trade, of course, annexing Canada, any minute now, the 51st state. You're right. So we are, so Canada, like Brazil, and you can inform me a little bit more about where Brazil is, but Canada has adopted various elements of GLOBE, not all of them. For example, our UTPR is just a blank line. There's nothing there yet.
We have only QDM.
Yeah. Okay, so yes. So you look at the structure of GLOBE, and you see that here's an idea. The conceptual structure is simple, very simple. The conceptual structure is, if you have a minimum tax on companies, then they will have less incentive to move things around to avoid tax. And they will instead move things around for other reasons to maximize their synergy to take advantage of global markets and so on. Yeah. And so this is the basic concept. And you have already learned that. You are aware that this conceptual idea, which underlies all of Globe, is, hey, what we're trying to stop is base erosion that is more or less tax motivated movement of capital, and we're not trying to interfere with the growth of multinationals, growth of trade across countries. Yeah. So you can see the conceptual idea, and even somebody who's not a tax expert can understand that conceptual idea. And then you look at the rules and maybe despair a little bit, right? You say, oh, these are the rules to do this? That's so complicated, and there's a lot of words. And when you start putting formulas together, and I think eventually we'll start, look at the formula together. Maybe we'll do a little exercise together, depending on how much time we have. When you look at the formula, you can see, like, if you just have that conceptual thread, look, 15% tax, no matter where you go, and for sure you're going to pay it. So don't play games. Don't try to move things around to avoid it, because you're going to pay it one way or the other. And you've seen the levels, right? So the QDMT, which you have in Brazil, which Canada has, trying to get more tax at the source. But you also know that when the OECD was conceptualizing this plan, there was no QDMTT. It was an IIR, the Income Inclusion Rule. And the idea was very much modeled on what you see in the US have seen for 60 years, and Canada has the same rules, which is the Controlled Foreign Corporation rule, where if you don't tax at source, then we deem you to have paid a dividend up the chain, and we tax the shareholder, the corporate shareholder at the top, right? You're familiar with that idea, and that's structurally the framework that makes the IIR, the income inclusion rule, makes sense, right? It's taking something we already seen, we all use, we all have CFCs. I don't know if Brazil had a CFC ever. Did you have a?
It's difficult to call CFC because it's much more. It's worldwide taxation immediately of
You tax
whatever you tax immediately. It's the worst scenario you can imagine.
No, because this is why it's always so interesting to come to Brazil, right? Because we are taught I was taught in the US. I did my law degree in the US. I was taught always, that the idea of the CFC is we have worldwide tax, but we want our companies to go explore overseas. We want them to get established. If they're doing real things, active things, we assume the other country will tax them, and we just leave them alone. Yeah. But Brazil is like, no, we don't assume that. We want to look through that corporate structure and keep taxing you the whole time. Yeah. So Brazil always a little bit of a standout in the world community. And then the OECD is like, well, don't you want to be friends with us? And then Brazil says yes. And then OECD says, well, then you have to act like us. If you want to be in a marriage with us, then you have to act like us. You have to change your transfer pricing rules and so on, right? So you know how that all works. Okay, so Brazil already did more than CFC. So this is very common then, no shock to anyone who studies tax in Brazil, to look at foreign operations and say, well, we're going to tax that. We're like, if we're at the parent level, we're going to tax that. And the opposite must also have been true. Brazil would always have had a corporate tax on foreign persons coming to Brazil. Right?
If you incorporate?
Yeah, no, like if I'm Canadian business and I come, incorporate, or I have a branch, even
if you incorporate, you're a Brazilian.
I'm
you're
a Brazilian,
corporate tax.
but if
you
I have a branch,
usually if it's a real branch, you treat it as a corporate tax.
okay, and so you would tax it.
Yep.
So why do you need a QDMTT? Because in the taxing of it, you have this little exception and that little credit and this little maybe incentive, the little, you make a patchwork quilt of interesting, yeah.
The other one was if
Yeah.
one of the authorities at least have given is if we have a lower ATR, and we are at risk of leaving money in the table, and the money that's on the table is going to be taxed elsewhere, well, then we better tax
Then
it
we
to
better
build the
tax it.
schools here than to let the schools be built elsewhere. That was the rationale
Yeah.
adopted by the government.
Yeah.
So
But so far, what I've seen from from what I've seen so far is that I'm not seeing ETR below 15% yet. I don't know whether you've seen it, but concretely seeing.
it's interesting because we have a high statutory rate compared. We have a 34% rate, and we don't have that much as a corroded base as other countries. We do have some regimes. We do have some specific regimes, and of course, ETR, as in everywhere, is sensitive to what kind of industry you are. Here in what kind of place in Brazil you are, because some of the regimes are regionalized. And so basically we have regional regimes. We have an M&A goodwill amortization that can lead to ETR being lower if you do, especially if you do your R&D through acquisitions, which is going to be an ETR driver. We also do have an ETR driver regarding R&D with double dipping deductions and everything, which is a special regime, which is much less attractive than regimes in other places. And we do have some nonsenses, like if companies are getting state level government grants through tax incentives, there's a wicked interpretation of the rules saying that you can exclude all the income from your taxable base, and you can deduct the expenses of the asset that you bought with the grant. So that is not accepted by the government, but some taxpayers are challenging in court and winning, and that can drive your ETR to zero. You deduct the expenses and you don't include any income, so it's the best of the thing in the world. So and
Okay.
and you know, some other sector specific things, but so hotel industry, post COVID, they did get a tax incentive that was never meant to be for
Yeah.
that long. So you might have lower ETR. So it's sector specific.
Yeah, one thing that I think it's very interesting here, Brazil, is because now you have the concept of stateless permanent establishment. So as long as you don't have a strict concept of permanent establishment here in Brazil, if the other country exempts the income, you can have this taxation here in Brazil. It's something very strange. I've seen this in practice. I think that's another situation in which you have KGMTT be applied in a situation that's
So it's filling up some holes.
yes.
Okay. All right. So, you know, what we do in taxes, we dig the hole, then we fill it up, then we dig it somewhere else, and then we say, we did something amazing. Look at the thing we did. I think that's what SBIE is. Okay. So now we come to SBIE. So, okay, you talked about R&D, you talked about incentives. This is exactly where we have to apply our lens when we start thinking about, okay, but remember, BEPS was trying to, base erosion profit shifting was trying to stop paper moving income around and not stop so-called real investment or real activity. And so when you talk about incentives, you talk about incentives having to do with COVID, and you talked about state level grants, you know, that doesn't sound to me like something that was trying to give create an opportunity for BEPS or like shuffling, right? So you see in the BEPS framework, have you talked at all about the non-refundable, refundable credit idea? A little bit? Okay, so you know that, okay, if you give a refundable credit, this is okay. This is okay, but a non-refundable credit is not okay. Okay. So what we see here is we see the base, we want to have this average. Then the QDMT comes along and says, okay, well, we could get it at source. If somebody else is going to take it, we may as well take it at source. We may as well take it at source. Yeah. So this is all of it makes sense. And then you see the UTPR slide in there as a backstop. If there's no QDMTT and there's no IIR, then maybe somewhere in the world there will be a UTPR. Until Trump was president, I thought, well, you know, the UTPR is what we in international law call a commitment projector. It's something that says that it will happen if, but the if will never happen, right? So your QDMTT is going to pick up on this side and somebody's IIR is going to pick up on the other, and no one is ever going to collect the UTPR, but it still needs to be there to commit everyone up and down. Except that everybody got it, yeah, to be the bad cop, yeah. But everybody kind of got a little upset about UTPR. Maybe Brazilians don't get upset, but other people get upset. Of course you do. Other people get upset because we have convinced ourselves, we have told ourselves a story about the nature of the corporation as an individual taxpayer, right? Separate taxpayer. And we have an idea that when we have the top level taxpayer that controls the lower level, then it's okay to pull the income up. That's okay. But you can never, from the perspective of our, you know, our collective wisdom in tax, you could never have a sister pull the money from a brother corporation. Dad and mom can pull from brother or sister, but brother or sister should never try to take from the other. That's sort of that's our received wisdom. So the UTPR is doing that, and that is interesting and problematic. You know, for some international law buffs, that's a problematic idea. But now we enter the SBIE. Okay, so this substance-based. Now think about the words that we're using: substance-based income exclusion. So the substance is what we're talking about. And we say the BAPS was supposed to stop games or like tax planning for base erosion, but leave alone the real, they mean the substance. What is substance? So we're gonna go through a little tiny bit about what the SBI thinks is substance. And I'm gonna say this, and then probably you'll disagree with me. So this should be interesting. Yeah, it'll be fun. Should be fun. Okay, so the idea of the substance-based income exclusion is if you're doing real things in the country, then it's not so bad to have these incentives. We're not trying to rid the world of industrial planning, right? That's the idea. It's like Brazil, you have a right to say, we want to help this kind of business, or we want to, especially with COVID, where there's, you know, whatever, there's all kinds of reasons to add. We don't want to say that Brazil, you're not allowed to use policy levers as an industrial policy, so long as the industrial policy is not tax avoidance, helping companies scrape income away from other countries. So long as that's not your industrial policy, and as you know, for some countries, that is an industrial policy, or at least we think we can imagine what that is in our minds. As long as that's not so then we can allow you to do some whatever. And how do we say this without saying it? Substance-based income exclusion. That's how we say it. That is how we say in OECD speak. You can give away incentives and you can do, you know, industrial policy for the real stuff, as long as you don't, you know, go past a certain level. And the level is that percentage is marked by that percentage in the SBI of how much you get to, how much you count that lets you exclude. So is everybody follow what I'm saying about industrial policy and like what's going on here? Yeah, okay. So if the OECD was honest, or I think forthright, it would say you can give tax incentives, just only give tax incentive for real things. And then we would have an argument internationally, well, what's a real thing? And then the Cayman Islands would say, and this is where you might disagree with me, the Cayman Islands would say, providing financial services is as real a thing as anyone can thing. right? It's as real as any other thing. We don't have mines in the Cayman Islands. I don't know if you've ever been to the Cayman Islands. There's no farms because it's a sandbar. There's no mines. There's nothing to mine. So before the financial sector, the Cayman Islands was tourism and fishing and tourism, and that does not make a very strong economy. That is a very weak economy. And then the financial sector took off, and some people figured out that it would be very useful to have flexible financial instruments and a nimble, these are the words they used. I don't know if you know this, a nimble legislature to, adapt the law to provide the financial services you need. And the Cayman Islands took off, not because people in the Cayman Islands thought of these things, but because accountants in the UK thought of these things and then went there and introduced them. And the same thing happened in the Netherlands Antilles, and the Americans went in other places. And so you have financial services, but that's not substance, is it? Why not? I mean, you try getting anywhere. I couldn't even get here without financial services. Like, it's more substance than anything else, really. But take a look at your SBIE. So just take a minute. If you haven't looked at SBIE yet, you know where to find it. You know you've been looking at the rules already. So let's talk about what is substance in the SBIE, because it's not financial services. Yeah.
You have associated payroll, many mines.
So it's kind of fascinating, because what is it if you aren't a tax expert with tax jargon? What is the substance? What is substance? Do you know? If you're not a tax person, if you're not an expert in tax, what words do you use to describe what the OECD has put in here in the substance?
Bricks and mortar.
Yeah, bricks, mortar, and people. Now, a funny thing about this idea. So if you see payroll, meaning how much did I pay
Which helps
my workers?
financial service.
Yes, that's true. That's a good point.
Sorry, I was just mentioning.
Yes,
the
you're supposed to
microphone.
disagree with me. Yes,
No,
it's your turn.
really. First of all, I published an article saying exactly this, so I'm so glad you.
Can't disagree.
We're good. We have 4 months to disagree, so no problem.
We'll find a way. We'll find a way.
No, but
Yeah.
just, I mean, I've seen that argument being used for formula apportionment, saying, well, you don't need intangibles on the formula because
Yes.
you build technology only with people and labs. If you don't you don't build it in your garage with a like little tube and an explosion. You
Correct.
really need an R&D center. So I'm gonna allocate whatever you have people and actual stuff there. So we don't need to deal with the intangibles because, the intangibles are
Yeah.
produced by brick and mortar and people. That's the argument, at least.
Yeah.
And, on no, the 5% is something that we're going to discuss later, because I think country risk adjustment is necessary even if you do that. But the rules double down on the brick and mortar, because it's not only SBIE. Is deferred taxes also, because the way they deal with the incentives is the SBIE, and also by bringing this the deferred tax liability current, you cap it at 15%, but you still puts the top up out by bringing in currently, so you can if it's accelerated depreciation, fixed expensing, and the recapture rules are the catch. Because if you do accelerated amortization of an intangible, then you're subject to recapture, unless you actually have it put down in 5 years from your assets. Then you need to recapture it to year one. Then your deferred tax is not going to count, and you need to reopen the year one. But if it's brick and mortar, then your deferred tax liability can go forever. So even if you depreciate the assets in 20 years, if there's an expensing rule for brick and mortar, then you're fine. And it's triple down, actually, because then you look at the qualified refundable tax credit, and the qualified refundable tax credit has an expenditure component to it, because, as we said a couple of days ago, profits incentives are not allowed because they would never be a refundable thing because it's based on income tax. So you need to base them on an expenditure. Well, there you can try to come up with an expenditure incentive that can lead to intangibles, but you still need to
Yeah.
have an expenditure over there. So it's the whole thing is kind of leaning to that. And the question, I think, going back to your first question, is that do we really agree with people and assets being what makes any business, or is there something else? Yeah.
So you said something about 5%. Can you elaborate? What were you saying?
Because they said that for SBI you get your sets times 5%. It
Yeah.
means you maybe have much. I don't know why 5%, where this number comes from, and in every economy would be only 5%. So the problem is very arbitrary.
Okay.
That means it's not true to say that substance has been preserved.
Right. I agree with you. Yes.
That's the other thing. I mean, the assumption is that anything above 5% is an economic rent, and then we should tax. But when you look at transfer pricing, and Ramon, I want your take on this. When you look at transfer pricing, if you're gonna do country risk adjustments, we are very familiar with the possibility of adjustment for country risks, and you're leaving more to a country with a higher risk.
Yeah.
That's all news in transfer pricing. I mean, you should try to find a comparable within your country, but if you can, and you're using a net margin method, you would do country risk adjustment. Why not? I mean, it's under a law actually. So why here you use a fixed amount if the same OECD allows for a adjustment and say on transfer pricing? Well, you should take into account country risk to compare. So if you're doing an SBIE exclusion, why aren't you letting M&Es do country risk adjustments to actually get what the expected return should be for an investment in a country like Brazil, which is definitely not the same that you would expect in Canada, in the US, or anywhere else. So I don't know your take on this.
Yeah. You want to add? Yeah, why not?
I'm gonna cover that in the presentation, but it's basically an imperfect way to tax economic rent because you don't have the carry forward for the SBIE carve out, and you don't have a full deduction of opportunity costs of capital, and there is the lack of intangibles in the formula. So I think first it's an imperfect way, and there are other alternatives that can be debate in relation to a proper way to calculate routine returns. So one alternative would be to consider something similar to ACC or ACA. So we would calculate a return over the total capital costs of an entity. Another alternative would be to simply use transfer pricing and calculate a routine return and then have the excessive profits similar to what we have in residual profit splitted method. And another alternative would be to have different routine profits depending on the sector with a country risk adjustment, which seems to be your proposal. So I think there are more perfect ways to deduct the routine return. But the problem here is that we have a kind of a trade-off because on the one hand, we would have more accuracy, but on the other hand, we would have more cost of compliance and cost of enforcement.
Cost of compliance and enforcement is something that they really let go with this whole thing. I mean, if they were thinking about reducing cost of compliance and enforcement, yeah, they should have push the brake a little bit because it's high cost all the way. So and transfer pricing and everything. So we're living in a high cost of compliance world.
So good. So this is useful and helpful. Think about it this way. So, okay, we are now thinking, okay, what is substance? It's humans doing things, and it's humans doing things in the context of physical assets, including buildings, properties, and so on, but also equipment, right? And so you get this SBIE is saying to you, if you want to give tax incentives for those activities in your country, you can, so long as you don't exceed this 5%. It's I think it's 8% right now until 9% until whenever the 5% kicks in. So even that is right. I mean, we're switching from one arbitrary number to another, and I actually tried to find out how did we come up with these percentages, and I got nowhere. I tried for a year to get someone to tell me how did we come up with the number, and it appears that it's just a nice number. People like the number 8, 9. These are popular numbers. 7 is not a popular number. 5 is very popular. So that is what the number is. But think about it. So if you're designing your tax system and you're told you can give a tax incentive, but you can't give out more than what would exceed the 5% return. I'm not saying it perfectly, but you understand my idea. You would have a hard time how do you do that? How, right? Like, how do you only keep your tax incentive to only that 5% return on payroll and tangible assets? Like, what kind of tailoring do you do? Do you create some kind of a credit that caps out once I don't know. I haven't seen it yet. I don't know how we're going to do that. But I believe when the SBIE gets introduced, I think the very first thing that happens is you see the OECD saying, okay, we're not going to, bother too much with incentives and so on for real things until they reach past 5%. Okay. Or 9 for a while. But remember, BEPS was supposed to stop base erosion, and it was not supposed to interfere with industrial policy. And what if your national advantage is in return to some kind of tangible property or certain kinds of payroll? And what if your return to payroll is on the basis that your payroll is low? Like, you get a nice return because you can pay less than maybe your competitors. Like, think about the incentive structure we have developed here. It's a strange thing to say that you can have industrial policy, but don't be too successful at generating returns from these things, because then you're back into BEPS world again. That's not why we had BEPS. So if you look at that, it's so simple, right? Like, the rule is not that hard. The SBIE calculation is so simple. But the incentive that's going on, or the thinking that's going on, is really not simple at all. And I wanted to just maybe ask this esteemed panel, when I understand why we had to take intangibles out. And I understand in formulary apportionment, every formulary apportionment thing I've ever seen anybody propose, they want intangibles out. There's always there's an exception. But you use the term economic rent. So I defy anyone to tell me what that is. Like, you can't, right? I mean, so if you think about SBIE and it says the 5% after the transition period, the 5% return is, we're saying that's a normal return, and everything above that is a supernormal return. So we're getting a lesson here that if your payroll produces more than 5%, what? You're getting a supernormal, you're getting an excess profit. And what does that mean? So I'm going to turn it over so you can argue with me a little bit. But what you're telling the world is, if you get more than 5%, it's an extraction from, I mean, we're just saying you have to tax over that, but putting it at 5% is saying, if you get more than 5%, that's a supernormal profit. It is hinting that maybe you're not paying your workers enough. They're being too productive for you. And What about your property? If you get more than 5%, well, maybe your the market for whatever property you have is too hot. It's in a bubble. And because everything above 5% is super normal. And that doesn't actually make any sense. Right? Okay. So I turn it over to the panel.
I just say I'm so sorry to agree with you again. I'm really sorry, but that's exactly what I think. It's not acceptable because you should say something I don't agree with. But that's it. It's very difficult to understand why this formula, because if you want substance based, okay,
Yeah.
this is not the correct. Every formula is wrong, and this is the
Yes.
worst. I mean, it's
Right.
very wrong. It
It's
has
very
nothing to
wrong.
do
Yeah.
with what the sets produce. They are not looking for this. They're simply fix something, a formula, and they call it substance based.
Yeah. To curb, but it's not to curb BEPS.
No, it's not. It's not. It's
But that's why it's insidious. So we'll get the panel and then we'll come back to say, and then we'll see. Okay.
Yeah, but I guess, all right, it's wrong, but what, I don't want to get to what is right, but is the mistake just with a fixed percentage? So if you had another industry adjusted, country adjusted percentage over assets and labor, would that be okay? Or would we need to have variable percentages and something else in the base? Or do we need to have something completely different entirely? So
two questions in one. I mean, the first one is if you want to say, okay, substance means bricks, which I don't agree, then at least look for in the sector so on what would be the normal return for that country, and for this sector, this industry, and so on. And I mean, as Ramon correctly said, you already have enough transfer pricing analysis to know this. If you wanted this. But the second question is substance. I mean, real investment, which because Edison correctly said, if the problem is base erosion and profit shifting means papers, means there is a value creation in one country, and there is a kind of transfer to the other. But you do not only create value with assets and payroll. I mean, you should look for what you're creating, where you're creating. It's much more complicated. Okay, how to do it? Certainly not with formula. I preferred Ramon's solution, which is a transfer pricing solution to look for. I mean, it may be more complicated, but since you are in this world, come on. We're talking about big multinationals. They are already used to this kind of analysis. Why can't you maintain at least coherence in this? Or the opposite. Or you return to, and that's, you may say, okay, quit this whole transfer pricing issue, get your formula or predetermined margins. I love predetermined margins. But then you assume what you're doing. I do. But I'm the only one who do.
May I, after Ramon tried attempt to disagree on something. Ramon, please go first.
No, I just think it's a political solution because on the one hand, we have countries targeting harmful tax competition and the other, all kinds of tax competition. And then they came to a conclusion, okay, we can allow tax competition over real economic activities, but up to a limit. And they set a limit in 5%, but there is no reasoning behind it. Yeah.
The problem is just what is real. Because come on, if it's real competition, it's okay to use to grant incentives for real competition. It's not a problem, provided you investments really are in the other place, provided value is created there. The problem is whether they are getting this. Paula, please.
No, it's just I think it's interesting to understand this rule against its background. So, of course, we all know Pillar 2 was all about building a consensus, and several developing countries were against the rules because they do want to provide tax incentives below the 15% rate. And those developing countries, they have, it was particularly countries with special economic zones where you really get, industrial buildings and working labor, blue collar labor generally, and in transfer pricing, those activities are assigned low margins. Although I want to be clear here, I absolutely disagree that the 5% margin is actually detrimental to developing countries, because obviously you need a higher return to face your higher risk. But then it was built in this context to accommodate this demand from developing countries. So the question is whether those countries are better off or without the substance-based exclusion, considering the kind of business that they are actually able to attract, because they're not going to attract a R&D research developing center. So I just wanted, I'm agreeing with Ramon here in the sense that it was necessary to build a political consensus. This was what was on the table, industrial kind of activities with low returns in special economic zones.
Paula,
That was my understanding. And this was what they achieved.
sorry, I can't accept that you say that these countries can't attract brains or whatsoever. So they are condemned to be developing countries for the whole, because that's why they were born like this. They must stay like this, and they should not dare to attract any real investment because they cannot. Come on, how can you say this and sleep at night? I would not never sleep. Come on,
It's not.
that's
It's
exactly what
not
we can't accept.
that I
Come on,
don't.
Professor, cannot see the reality. They cannot. Nobody with brains would go to such a country to stay there.
That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that's what they requested, and historically there is very little country mobility, and this is a fact.
Okay, so it's a fact that you may offer tax incentives for these people to go there because it makes it attractive to decide to invest in these regions. Come on, Paula, where are you from?
I'm
I
not
see
saying that's the
I
policy.
see your accent, so most probably what you've learned is not what I think.
Okay, so it's always fun to be around you, and this is why I remember how much fun it is. But in actuality, I don't know if you can name an industry anymore that doesn't have a pretty serious R&D component. Like even mining. I mean, sending engineers from yeah, absolutely, right? So yeah,
Just say agriculture here in Brazil. You're going to see what we have here, and I mean, research and development here in Brazil for agriculture. What's been done here, Paula?
I don't know, Paula, but don't be too upset. Don't be too upset about this, Paula.
There, it was
I'm gonna-
100% not what I said, but I
No, I know.
understand that
But-
he's mad because that's all classes we have that I attend, that he's the lecturer. We end up
Okay.
with this kind of discussion. So,
But-
I don't, Professor, I'm a great friend. just wanted to make clear, but don't worry, I'm very used to it. He always gets upset with what I say. That's fine.
Okay. So I like but the underlying question I think is important. I want to get to it. So I just want to say this though. I met someone who does milking cows in Canada. That's like a very old thing to do. They're using AI R&D processes to predict, flow and whatever, blah, blah, blah. I don't know. When you get talking to someone, you're like, your eyes glaze over just the way other people are when they talk to us about tax. Their eyes glaze over. They don't want us to talk about it anymore. That is how this woman was with her AI cows. So mining, I have seen like the complexity of knowledge transfer, knowledge mobilization across borders in mining, where you're talking about like ever more sophisticated ways of doing. Okay, so I just think R&D is kind of in everything. But so I think the animation for your question is, given that you see more industrial policy in a visible way in countries that are trying to attract certain industries than you see in countries that are more financial capital outflow countries. Okay, I'm going to say that. I said that in a very politically correct, very careful diplomatic way. And now I'll just say it one more way just to make sure we're on the same page. If you are trying to attract capital to employ local labor to do low value, low skilled things like textile, manufacturing, just in time stuff. Low skilled workers can have jobs. If you're doing that, then there's no way you can say the SBIE is a bad thing, right? Because your thing is we've got a lot of unskilled labor. The return to unskilled labor is probably in the range. So we can continue to incentivize foreigners, foreign capital, to come in and do those processes. We're still in position. And if you take that away from us, how do countries that are exporting capital compete? They're not competing with this kind of tax incentive. They're doing something else, but they're competing. And that range of possibilities when you're a capital exporter, your ability to hide the incentive in some other way, hide it in the way that you hand out money, that's not built into the globe. This one is. So if you're trying to attract low wage, low skilled workers in the SEZ style, then I don't know how you could say SBIE is bad. It's neutral. It preserves the status quo. It preserves, yeah.
So what you're saying, because I did publish an article saying more or less like this. So you're authorized as a developing country to continue developing country, provided you behave like one. So what you may not dare is to offer an incentive to try to develop.
That is problematic, right? Like, so when I think about how rules get made internationally, I just say when the US, when they're being in a cooperative mood, even when they're in a cooperative mood, they're not actually that cooperative. They're interested in making sure that their capital can get countries to compete for it, right? That's better. Like the US has no interest in having Brazil or anyone tax American companies investing in Brazil. Like what's in it for the US? So if that's the mindset, then you start making rules where you point your finger at certain, you talked about harmful tax competition. If you dig into those words, just the same way that I ask you to dig into what's the word substance or real, if you dig into those words, what you will find is any competition that the US is doing is okay, and any competition that Cayman Islands is doing is not okay. Any competition that the US is doing through industrial policy that isn't in the form of a tax incentive, but it could be anything else, is fine, untouchable. But as soon as we can see what you're doing is incentivizing, and you're in a world of incentivizing things that we're trying to control, then we don't like it. So this is difficult politics, but the reality is that OECD comes up with SBIE to preserve this idea that bricks and mortar and people, you should be able to use your industrial policy to attract that. Meanwhile, countries that are exporting capital all over the world, especially the US, but also China, countries that are exporting capital don't need an SBIE, because that's not where they're putting their incentives, I think. I mean, that's a matter of opinion. So, okay, so I think I'm not sure how much time we have. We may be out of time, actually.
Gustavo, no. This group is going up to 8 p.m. Someone speaking about how long? Oh,
So we can.
I'd love to just go.
Just to say, the dean sent an email asking professors generally, if possible, because there's going to be some kind of cultural activity in the law school because they are opening a new room there and so on, as from 7:30. So he asked, if possible, whether, I don't know whether students want to go there, but that's what I received an email asking the possibility, if possible, to allow students to go to Academia de Letras, because the room is going to be open today. There shall be several Uh, yes, there's going to be several activities there, cultural activities and so on. Sorry, I don't need to be there. I'm just telling because this has been said, and so I must formally say that this has been said. But else, up to 8 p.m. would be the regular time.
But we are also trying to get some transfer pricing in here, I think, or something. Yeah.
No, we're gonna. It's the same debate, I guess. If
Okay.
you want me to open yours,
You wanna just
something, when you speak, we can have it.
okay. Yeah.
Do you think that the SBIE formula is more related to previous OECD initiatives? Because, for instance, the OECD believes that intangible assets are movable, so they can M&Es can shift then from one jurisdiction to another to paperwork. There is valuation issues, and the ownership of intangible is something almost irrelevant for transfer pricing purpose because you have now the function, so you cannot attribute the intangible to a specific jurisdiction, which is the main point of calculation from Pillar 2. And in relation to the payroll, the OECD follows the concept of relevant people functions because under the OECD view, even the capital does not reproduce by itself. You need to have someone behind it taking decisions. So I think basically the policy is like a continuation of the OECD has done in BEPS and in previous initiatives. So that's why they use this as a proxy for real economic activity.
No. So if you ever talk to anyone who's been in the business for a while, they will say real. They will say real, and this is what they mean. They mean like property, plant, equipment, and people, right? So it's like almost a triggered response. Like we've been taught these are the words we use, and so this is what we know. So, but I think my worry is that to the extent the OECD continues to do that because they talk about, well, intangibles are hard to value. Yes, and courts make a lot of mistakes when they look at it, and it's not good that it's so malleable. Yeah. So I think when it comes down to it, if you and I sat down and said, okay, we got to start over, we're going to make a new system, we would almost certainly get to the same place. Almost certainly, not because it's right, but because it's too easy to put those intangibles anywhere. And this is what, in a sense, is the real problem here. So here's the struggle though. I don't know how to answer this, and I'll just give this to you as this is something I think about a lot. So you know that even while the OECD was planning all of this stuff, everybody was doing the patent box. You know what a patent box is? Some not. So a patent box is, it's just it's just so many words, but it's an incentive. If you've got IP, if you've got an idea, I want you to come to my country and develop your idea. Don't go somewhere else with your idea. Come to my country. And if you come to my country with your idea and develop it, then I'm going to like put your income from developing that idea in a box and not tax it. What's real about that? Well, everything and nothing. But why is a patent box totally okay? Like, even as we're doing all of this, it is totally okay today. You could do a patent box today, and somehow this is acceptable. I don't understand how that happens, other than to say that, well, OECD countries have patent boxes, and non-OECD countries don't have patent boxes, or they didn't use them for a long time, right? So when you have those politics involved, I don't know how to reconcile that problem, right? How can a patent box survive globe? How is that possible? I don't understand. Well, because they're refundable credits, or they've done it in a different way, and yeah. But the whole point of the patent box is to steal or poach the capital from another country. There is no other point. That's it.
I must confess that for me it's very difficult. Very difficult. Maybe you have a hint to understand why there's a difference between refundable and non-refundable tax incentive. Really, it's okay. Let's understand this.
What do you know so far about?
No, I want to hear from you because for me it's very complicated because you see, either you say I don't want incentives because I want no competition, or yes, okay, competition, tax incentives or not. Maybe because, and please, I'm just guessing, because there are some people who say the tax incentives are bad policy. Taxes are not to be there for so this idea more ideologically to say, come on, why tax incentives?
Good, right? So far, so good. Okay, here's the difference, right? What is actually a refundable tax credit? What is, if you didn't use those terms? Well, it's a subsidy. Exactly, it's a subsidy. Why?
And what is a tax incentive? It's a subsidy also.
It's a subsidy. It's a subsidy. And there sits the WTO, right? And it's always been a mystery to those of us, I think, in tax who study tax and trade, how the trade people can sit over there and talk about countervailing duties for subsidies and somehow be completely oblivious, totally oblivious to how we do subsidies through the tax laws, right?
Just Gustavo's PhD thesis, so I think he wants to say now.
Amazing. Good. Okay. So let me finish the thought and then you can dispute or fix or whatever. Okay. So what is a non-refundable credit? It's unlimited subsidy targeted to an industry, right? Because you don't know when you do a non-refundable tax credit, you don't actually know how much money you're going to give away. That's why it's so dangerous. That's why countries don't do them generally. They call them subsidies and they set a number at them and they say you can have this much money for doing that thing, or you can have this contract. You're going to have an exclusive contract. We won't let anybody else do it and we won't raise your taxes. That's our subsidy for you. And guess what? All those contracts are still in play. They're still in play. So some of them are 30, 50 years, these investment protection contracts, right? So it's a non-refundable credit is an unlimitable subsidy that most governments will be very careful. They will target them to favored industries because that's you're in danger. You don't know how much you're going to spend. Whereas a refundable credit means only if you come up with a profit am I gonna give you the credit. Only if you have something against which to take the credit, right? So if I say you can have a child care credit, well, if you don't have any child care expenses and you don't have any children, you're not getting the credit, right? So that means I can use demographics. I can figure out how much that's going to cost me. I can cost it into my budget. I know exactly, or not exactly, but I have a very good idea about how much I'm going to give away when I do a credit. I can also target it more for people with lower income and less for people with higher income. But it's a subsidy, and usually governments are careful. They're careful when they do subsidies because they don't want to blow a hole in the budget and throw it all away. Okay, that's what I was going to say. Let's see what happens next.
Thank you. No, no. I mean, I think it is a differentiation that I'm not gonna say makes sense in the whole rules, but it is different for you to differentiate to have a refundable credit or a non-refundable. I mean, if you're limiting to what you're gonna get on tax revenue, first of all, you are protected in that sense, and second, usually leads to profit incentives, even if it's an expenditure base, it's expenditure slash profit because it's expenditure based for those who have profits. For those who don't, you're not incentivizing anything, which is very different from a direct subsidy or a grant. Just wait a second. There's a rationale. And it makes a difference, especially if you're doing R&D and other stuff, because the hole that you can do in the budget might be endless if you do it refundable. Of course, you can cap it, and I don't think that would be against the rules, at least not in the first thought. That you can cap it on a first come first served, or you can do it. Well, by whom?
international law that you can't give somebody a subsidy and not the base guy.
Well, but you could do well. My program can cost only up to an X amount because that's the money I get, and you do a criteria for selection for that year, for the decade, or whatever, and you do it as a grant. I mean that's not against the rules unless you put the money that you got on the RQ, the MTT, or IRR, you put it back, and then you're hurting the no benefits. But otherwise, it's fine. But still, it's different than making it contingent on profit. Just wait. And for profit shifting, that's definitely different. But supposedly we're not worried about profit shifting on this thing. So, but still, it's something else. Regarding the WTO, just a couple of words. If you first, you need to consider that WTO is still alive, which is a big if. Yeah, but even if it were, I mean, if you take it historically, the subsidies that they historically they worry is the export subsidies or the ones that are discriminating on imports on foreign goods or national goods. Those, if you do it by tax incentives, they might get it as they got the American regime, although you have something similar right now. But the foreign sales corporations and the Brazilian regimes with indirect taxes, so they do care about it. But if you go to yellow subsidies, those that are not contingent on export of goods or discrimination on imports, those are really hard to get because you have to prove damage, and you have to have a government willing to go there and put their face and they usually will go to an anti-dumping measure instead of doing a subsidy case because it's much easier, it's much more politically acceptable, and the things you have to prove are completely different. So unless it's a real clear violation of the GATT and the subsidy agreement as an export subsidy, which you don't have to prove damage, you don't have to prove anything, you just have to prove that it's contingent on export or it's discriminating between imported and national goods, then you have a WTO case. Used to. Right now, you might have a case, but that might not matter. But I think that's the distinction, not much the tax and non-tax thing, but it's just that the subsidies that you can really make a case for and politically go are only the exports.
From a policy perspective, I also agree that other subsidies better because, of course, you have transparency, because you know how much you're paying, because it's the budget. Everybody knows from a policy perspective, theoretical. On the other hand, also policy, but the other hand, I've heard from several companies and so on saying tax incentives, you do not depend on the government, you simply get it, use it, and you don't depend on bureaucracy. And they say, if I'm going to wait for bureaucracy to give me the money, maybe it's going to be too late. And in the real world, I need the money now. So that's, again, it's a policy issue. One, the other one, it's good or bad for one country. But my question was another one. From a competition perspective, which means why do you allow one competition or the other? Because one or the other are doing exactly the same thing. I mean, either you are attracting or not attracting. So what you can see, and this may be something clear, it's a paternalistic approach, a typical paternalistic approach of OECD to say, come on, since you have never studied what a good policy is, so for good students with good behavior, okay. But maybe, I mean, it's more paternalistic because from a competition perspective, sorry, Gustavo, refundable, not refundable, it's the same.
I mean, one is related to the tax you would be getting and you're foregoing, but the other is not. So, I mean, if you,
But it is. I mean, okay. So I went to law school because I love words. I love crosswords. I love how every crossword clue is like, it could be multiple words. A word can have many meanings. I think we see the best example of the power of language to make you think something is something different or distinguishable when it isn't, can be seen in President Trump's latest executive orders, where value-added taxes are tariffs. Now, someone, I don't think that Donald Trump has thought this through. I don't actually know what he thinks through, right? But someone has advised him, well, Europe has a national sales excise tax that is collected through the chain and only imposed on the final consumer. And when the final consumer is us, we have to pay it. But if it's not us, we don't have to pay it. And this is just economically exactly like a tariff. And all the people around the table nodded yes. And Trump has also said that there's some language. I need to go find, actually, I read it, I've been reading too much and then I don't footnote it immediately, but I need to do this. He said something like, he said the word normal. Normal international taxes are not going to be subject to tariffs. And he included, somewhere along the line, somebody included withholding taxes. Withholding taxes are excise taxes. They're ad valorem gross basis excise taxes on a price. So they're not income taxes because they're not based on income. They're based on cash flow. So we accept, we build our vocabulary and we accept there's a tariff, and that's a different thing than a value added tax, which is a different thing than an income tax, which is a different thing than an excise tax, which is but an economist in a case in the United States that was about the UK privatizing the energy industry one time, a long time ago in the 70s. The UK privatized the energy industry, and then later, it was under Thatcher, and then later people said, hey, you should have got more money. When you privatize, you should get more money because you gave away the store and that's bad. You should get some more money. And so the UK imposed a new tax on the companies that had been privatized, and they gave it a new name, like a haha, you can't catch me. I don't know what kind of tax this is kind of tax. Yeah. The case is PPL. The US investors in that chain said, that's an income tax. We should get a credit. They wanted the US to credit this new UK tax. Now, you want to talk about the power of words. The economists in that case went to the Supreme Court of the United States. Now, they're not the smartest people in the world, but they're not dummies. But they're not tax people. But the economists came and showed with charts and graphs and numbers and examples and an Excel spreadsheet and, I don't know, some magic, that if you looked at just the right way, if you just looked at this tax just the right way, you squint a little bit and you kind of look from the side, don't look at it straight, it looks a lot like it basically sort of gets at the profits they had been receiving since they privatized. So it's an income tax. And they win. They win the case. And I see this kind of thing and I say, you say to me economic rent. I say to you excess profit. You say to me excise tax. I say to you value added tax. You say to me subsidy. I say to you non-refundable credit. You say to me refundable credit. I say withholding tax exemption. You say to me, I have a withholding tax exemption, but I want more. I say to you, what we call in Canada, exempt surplus. Like we are all, this war of the words that we are having, and I think it's directly related. This, when I put my notes together, my thoughts together to come talk to you about SBIE, I thought to myself, well, how do you make a tax system that says we only want to let you use industrial policy for the things that we expect you to use industrial policy for? Yeah, that we allow. And we, being the OECD countries, we are going to decide that. Remember that the inclusive framework which is neither inclusive nor a framework, was about implementing BEPS. It was not about deciding what the policies should be, what the rules should be. No, no, the rules had already been decided. And one of those, going back to that question, harmful tax competition, you go read that 1998 report and you are going to see them tie themselves in knots to try to figure out how to say, well, when you do it, it's harmful. And when we do it, it's not harmful. It's good industrial policy competition. That is what the OECD's message ultimately, I think, is. When we do it, it's, and when you do it, it's harmful, you're poaching, you're blah, 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 blah.
Just a question, and I completely agree with you in 98. But my question is, during BEPS,
Yeah.
was there not a change in this approach in Action 5?
Oh, I say no. I say no. Look at the year. Look at how we got the inclusive framework. You know how we got it. It was in Addis Ababa in 2015 when the group of 77 so-called developing countries brought a agenda item. They wanted a resolution. They said, be it resolved that tax policy needs to be taking place in an forum that includes developing countries as decision makers, and that's the UN. This was in 2015. In 2015, the US, the UK, Canada, Australia, they're like, no. And the very next month after that, Addis, they started talking about a forum. And it's not the first OECD forum. Okay, the first OECD forum is the Financial Action FATF Forum, something. I'd have to go back and look in my notes. The OECD had tested this before. They had it was information exchange, and they had tested it by doing a forum, a global forum. Remember the global forum? And they said, oh, you can come in. We have these rules now, and we're going to be peer monitoring you. We're going to be peer reviewing you, but you can come in and we'll have a forum and we'll have discussions about it. But the countries that were not OECD members were not allowed to say what the terms of reference were. Right. So Addis comes, the developing countries say we want to move to the UN. The key OECD countries say no, and they build the inclusive framework to respond to it. They say, we're going to do the inclusive framework. They're going to do a mini UN. And we are in charge of the mini UN. And the UN, don't forget the inclusive framework. It's not called the inclusive framework. It is the inclusive framework to implement BEPS, right? So I know that what happened in the order of things. I don't know what happened behind closed doors or what they said to themselves. But here's what I imagine. You tell me if I imagine that Pascal Saint-Amand is trying to build this program, and the incredible weight of the moral lack of any justification for Pascal Saint-Amand to do this without consulting with 95% of the world's population, or however percentage not in the OECD. The utter lack of moral, there's no foundation for him to do that. It came clear to him in Addis. Like, if I don't make something happen here, there's going to be a revolution. So I need to make something happen. And so this is my understanding. In terms of the timeline, this is what I say happened. You can maybe disagree with that, but I see comments.
I was not going to disagree. I was asking something different. Whether the 1998 paper yes, and BEPS in 2015, Action 5. Would you say that it's the same mentality or it has changed?
Same line. Yes.
But some difference because 1998, and I agree with you. They said that substance would be admitted. So they only wanted to avoid if it were so.
Yeah, that's a good point. Maybe when it comes down to it, the tax policy is being developed by technocrats. They understand this. And once it gets a hold of by the politicians, then it changed to what we have today. Maybe. Yeah.
My point is similar to what Professor Schwede just raised, because if you look Action 5 and the modified nexus approach, we may have an IP regime where all the qualified expenses to develop the intangible were incurred in that jurisdiction, and then this jurisdiction is allowed to give tax incentives to royalty income derived from such intangible. But then under Pillar 2, we may have a taxation of that unless we change to a refundable tax credit. So it's not completely coherent with previous OECD initiatives. And if we compare to 1998 report, we have low taxation, ring-fenced regime, and other standards that are not compatible with Pillar 2. So I think there is a incoherence with previous measures of the OECD.
Think that's just a natural progression as you go from the technocrats in a closed system to being pushed out into this political world.
If I recall correctly, after the first harmful tax competition, which was on low tax and so on, it changed it to say, provided you are cooperative jurisdiction, it would be okay. So the low tax was not an issue anymore. The problem was only transparency, and then you returned.
Okay, but you know why that happened? Because it was about low tax until the US regime change. And then the new US Bush said, we actually don't agree because half of our financial sector is based on sucking money out of Latin America. I don't know if you remember this, but yes. Okay, so you have to go back to 1986. You have to go back to the portfolio interest exemption in the US, right? US adopts, okay, you have to go even further back. You have to go back to the Eurobond market, which prompted the US to want to stop taxing interest going to foreigners, right? Because the US said the European bond market is non-taxable and we're taxing interest. We don't want to do that. And the US introduced the portfolio interest exemption in 1986, and Latin America's capital markets, yeah, absolutely emptied out and into the US. And half of that money, not half, I'm exaggerating. I have no idea what percentage. Some percentage of those capital flows end up in the world's most secretive jurisdiction, the place where if you want to do money laundering and never be found, if you want to hide your money and never be found, it's in the US.
Because they couldn't even flow there in the first place.
Exactly.
We had rules not allowing the capital flow.
Exactly. So
we had hyperinflation. We had probable seizure of assets and everything. So
exactly.
it flew.
It flew. Now, the U.S. banking system is sitting on top of an incredible source of wealth, which is hiding. Okay, but when the U.S. does it, it's not illegal. Right. So the US did that. Now, when Switzerland started doing this, when Switzerland became so blatant that the US lawmakers couldn't look the other way. And in 1992, I think it's 1992 or 93, maybe 94, somewhere around there, the US gets wind that in a number of island jurisdictions, wealthy Americans were stashing money and they had a credit card and they could access it at any time. It was becoming retail tax evasion. Before that, it was, you had to be rich to be a tax evader. So America was facilitating tax evasion, absolutely facilitating it for all the rest of the world. But when Americans were tax evading, then America said, we got to put a stop to this. And that gave the OECD some oomph. They were like, okay, we're ready. We know what to do. We're going to shut down the tax havens. And the US was on board because in that moment, from the late 90s, mid 90s, the US was saying the US Americans, doctors and dentists are being courted by Switzerland, by the Cayman Islands, by these islands jurisdictions. They're being courted. They're being invited to tax evade, and we aren't doing anything about it. The US got in there. They got into the OECD. They developed the harmful tax. They did the Ottawa thing. They wrote the 1998 thing. And then Bush gets elected. He says, whoa, 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 whoa. We don't want to stop tax evasion. We make money off tax evasion. And even today, you will hear people say things like America is responsible giving tax evasion because if you didn't allow tax evasion, why people, what would happen to people in Russia? They would be paying tax to Russia. I mean, that's no good. You can't have people paying tax to tyrants and dictatorships. We are being helpful in the world by providing a safe place where no one's going to steal, expropriate your money, and no tyrant is going to take off with your money and, you know, use it to buy a yacht for themselves. No one's so we're the good guys allowing tax evasion. We're the good guys. You will still hear Americans say that today. So for me, I see that line is so clear. 1990s, America has the same problem that other countries have. They don't want tax evasion. So they go along with the OECD. Regime change. Right-wing Americans do not agree with that. They believe that America's financial market benefits from being a financial a place where people can create companies that are anonymous. Anonymous. You can still do that in America. Can you do that in Brazil? No. No. Have a bank account that's totally a numbered account, numbered companies all the way up and down in LLCs, and nobody knows who owns what. Can you do that in Brazil? No. But you can do that in America. So for me, I see the line. It's very clear. I don't want to overestimate the US influence on the rest of the world, but I think you have to see this trajectory that when the US interests seem to align with Europe, the OECD gets things done. And as soon as the US interests do not seem to align with Europe, but seem to be in competition with Europe, or they have a different idea about what is going to be good for the US, then the OECD project is bad and no one should do it. And if you do it, we're going to give you tariffs. To me, that's not okay. That was my little speech. That was a big speech, but there you go. That's my answer to your question.
I have two questions. First one, do you think there is any relationship between the failure of Pillar 1 and the substance-based exclusion? I can elaborate a little bit more. And thinking about the failure of Pillar 1, we're seeing a kind of overcoming the process of ring fence solution, and to see the recapture the whole economy based on the rethinking of transfer price solution, or we're thinking about the taxing powers between countries in general. But in somehow we saw there a problem of a different kind of ring fence, a different kind of select some features of certain companies, and to create another circle of, oh, we have to see these companies in a different way. Mature companies with a different level of development of R&D, different companies would have a high level of mobility, some features that we can see in these companies. And now, based on this exclusion, it's a different way to recapture the same idea of Pillar 1, but Pillar 1 failure. So it's a second round of Pillar 1.
Another shot.
Another shot. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, maybe you guys have thoughts on this. First of all, are you sure Pillar 1 is dead? I don't know. But
in the US
it's so
now?
dead. It's so dead. Okay, so here. Not yet. I will say. So I want to hear a little bit more about how you connect them. I think there is, but I want to hear your version of that first. But here's what all I want to say before I get that version. When the DSTs started coming out, I made a timeline, and I started doing a little research. I'm doing talk looking at this, and I said, why are we doing this? Why are we doing DSTs when we know that the US is going to see these as tariffs? They've stopped, right? And we have a really, I think your mic just died.
That's it.
Yeah, are we good? Here, you know what to do. Brazil knows what to do. You don't need a DST. You do a withholding tax.
Yes,
You do a withholding. Come on. Exactly. You have a withholding tax for everything. That's why Brazil is exemplary for the world. I understand, but I have an economist that if you look at it just the same right way, a little squint in this from the side, it is exactly the same thing. It is exactly the same thing.
You don't catch everything.
Okay, but wait. So I know. So okay, so let me add in. Yeah, okay. So all right. So okay. No, oh my gosh, they just switched to Portuguese, so you know it's serious now. Okay. So I want to come back to that, but I just want to have you say just a little bit more about why, how you connect specifically to the SBIE. I'm curious about that. So I have that too, but I want to see what you
Yeah,
say.
because we're seeing the payroll and the tangible assets as two features, two elements or proxies to identify these companies. And what kind of companies we're seeing here? And Britain Morton companies is close to there, but doing this, we're create a kind of incentive, and kind of incentivation for companies which are out of the digital economy. So the digital economy was the target on the pillar one. So if I create an incentive which makes a harmful effect for digital economy, I achieving the digital economy as well. So that's my relationship with that.
You had something to say.
No, I would say something about the DST, but I'll do it.
Okay. Okay.
But I have a second question.
Yeah.
We can discuss both of that. And the second question is as well related to base exclusion. And my question is a kind of a constitutional issue, because we're thinking about the payroll and the tangible assets as two criteria to charge income tax. And I have some doubts about the accurate capacity to this criteria to assess the ability to pay. So we have the problem of the equality here. We're comparing two taxpayers based on one criterion, which does not assess ability to pay. So the fact that I have more payroll or less payroll, it doesn't matter for ability to pay. The fact that I have more tangible assets or less tangible, it doesn't have any relationship with the ability to pay. So if I used a criteria to compare two taxpayers to charge income tax, which doesn't assess income, is it possible to use those two criteria, or I have a problem with that accurate point or accurate proxies to assess ability to pay off to taxpayers? That's my point.
I can't answer this constitutional question, so one of you is going to have to deal with this. But let me ask you this. Does a foreign person have a constitutional protection? Like if it's a foreign company
Yes.
getting digital, they also are entitled to the ability to pay?
No, but I think his point is with the Q. I think his point, just as far as constitutional protection is concerned, his point is the QDMTT would apply to a sub of the foreign company, so the local sub would have the protection as a local sub. Of course, you can discuss if ability to pay applies to corporation and something like that, but I won't get into that now. But that's the kind of protection that you're going to get, and you can challenge it in courts.
I don't know.
Yeah, but
In relation to the first question, under the amount A, the idea is to reallocate part of the income of the multinational group to the market jurisdiction when the MNEs does not have a presence in the country. So from that perspective, in order to have the pillar 2, I need to have a constituted entity in that jurisdiction. So the only relation that I can see is maybe a stimulus to establish a presence in the market jurisdiction in order to claim the SBIE deduction. So I don't know if this is the point that you had in mind. And the second relationship that I can see is that under the amount B, I have a streamline return, a limited return to certain activities. It's a more a simplified measure, but it's somehow related to the idea that I have also a limited return under the SBIE. And in relation to the ability to pay, I think one point that may arise is the fact that if I have a domestic group with gross revenue over 750 million, it would not be subject to the QDMTT. And on the other hand, if I have a multinational group with gross revenue over that, I am in the gateway of the Pillar 2 rules, and then I am subject to the QDMTT. So I have different tax treatment to two groups that are that have the same level of gross revenue, and then it would create a potential issue in relation to the ability to pay.
I mean, just we can try to make a lot of constitutional arguments against the thing, and you know that we know that the one with the labor, I think is probably going to be the hardest because we have a labor distinction authorization for the social contribution and the constitutional thing. I think that will be the hardest one. You can do all the sort of discrimination, international presence, local presence, because that is not written in the constitution. But the labor one is probably the one that would fly as a legitimate discrimination in that specific social contribution. Just some, I don't know if anybody wants to go first, but yeah, all right.
But the constituent entity can be a non-corporate, like it could be a PE. So then it goes back to that question, like I don't actually have a Brazilian person there. How would I have a constitutional, do I have a constitutional right if I'm not a Brazilian?
Now, since we don't have specific rules for PE taxation, we just we just tax them as if they were corporations. I'll probably see.
Your definition of legal entity for tax purposes in Brazil, you include clearly branches.
Okay, so it is.
So I wouldn't have a hard time seeing a foreign corporation trying to make a case in Brazilian courts. I mean that in the U.S. probably wouldn't fly, but I think here it would. The argument I don't think as much, but I think they could make a case. Just circling back on some issues, I guess. The first one, the whole income allocation and Pillar 2 for me is a complicated relationship because Pillar 2, if you look at it, how it was designed, it has absolutely nothing to say on how income should be allocated. So it's transfer pricing reliant. It doesn't say anything about income allocation. So when you put SBIE,
Single tax principle to say you must pay tax somewhere, irrespective of where, but you must pay somewhere, which is something which makes no sorry. Reuven is a very good friend of mine. I've even slept at his home, okay? But I can't agree.
but that's the thing. I mean, you are relying on transfer pricing to allocate the income, and then whatever is allocated, and the global profit is transfer pricing adjusted, and then you cannot tax it below an effective rate of 15%. So income allocation is not within the rules, and when you put something like SBIE and we start discussing about how much income you can allocate in regard to your assets and something that then I think realize the issue, and you either take it out or you're going to bring a discussion into the rules that were not supposed to be into the rules in the first place. But then again, if you take it out, you're giving nothing to development. I mean, and I think that was Paula's point before. I mean, if you have the choice between having something or nothing as a developed country, you take something. And that's not because I think I'm an idiot and the only thing that I can produce is as much to that point, but it's something. It's either something or nothing. I mean, politically, I would choose something any day because I'm not an idiot, politically speaking. So,
Thank you.
But Tony, may I add to your point?
Oh,
Just may I hop on
Sure.
and add to your point?
Sure.
No, and I think that's exactly it. And also relating to what was said before. So the OECD is a club of very wealthy countries. They opened a very small window for developing countries. They said, you're going to take this, you're going to take this without a substance exclusion, without the possibility of offering zero tax rate on export manufacturing zones, on anything that you have designed to attract industrial activity. Or you can take this with this very little exception that's going to make you very partially happy. And that was it. So I think I think the benefit is good to that extent. And there is all the things that we discussed during the course that in the end, the substance-based exclusion does allow developed countries to shelter a part of their income and etc. and may jeopardize the development of R&D in developing countries. But then let's be honest, it's not going to be because of a tax incentive that research centers are going to move to African countries or are going to come to South America. That's not the politics that attracts research and development. This is long-term investment on qualified professionals and everything. So this is also something I wanted to point out, that is not a patent box in Nigeria that is going to make that country developed. And I think that was an honest recognition of what can be done through tax incentives in terms of development path. So thank you.
You know, Paula, just before Shweta starts, I fully agree. I fully agree. And you know, Shweta is talking here about look at the agriculture that we have here. You know what we should do to really develop agriculture? We should stop taxing services as source, because that's a huge cost for developing anything here, for developing technology here. We should stop taxing royalties at 25% as source, because that's a huge incentive for us to bring technology here. And you know, it's not a patent box regime that's going to solve that. It's getting rid of bad tax policies to actually have access to technology and try to develop a long-term policy of development here. I fully agree with you.
I can agree with you that we should stop with this, with taxing technology and so on, imported technology. And so I of course I agree. But to say that we cannot develop technology here, come on, get Imprapa, get what will be done. I have clients which have this, with these tax incentives, which presently do have for research and development. They are making good research with very interesting things. Come on, get ethanol products and so on. Come on, Paula.
No,
Sorry.
100% agree. That
Okay.
that's
So
the
sorry,
thing. The
Paula. If you
proposal was
agree,
not for Brazil.
sorry, Paula, if you agree, and Gustavo
No, but
agreed,
just
and sorry, just to say, we have not so much time, and Ramon has
Wow.
also his presentation. So my suggestion would be to go to Ramon. Yes, okay. Ramon would make the presentation, but Ramon, don't you believe you're going to speak alone, because we are going to interrupt you, and that's what we're doing.
Shweta, I think well, Alison has a couple of points to make, and we should have finished the debate, but there are a couple of issues that we need to get into. But Edison, go first, and Ramon, I don't know, maybe all right, sure,
Yeah, you can. It's good. I like it. It's good conversation. Yeah, we'll just interrupt.
all right,
Yeah.
okay,
Yes. See what you got. Yeah. Yeah.
all right.
Yeah. Good.
You tell me. I'll share the slides, and then we can go through a couple of topics, and let me just.
I think you can skip some slides because okay. I had split my presentation in tax policy issues and then more practical issues. So, but we have discussed some of the topics that I had in these first slides. So the idea was to present different views that countries may have on tax competition, something that we have discussed previously, and the compromise solution that it's an imperfect way to focus Pillar 2 on harmful tax competition, but it's not completely coherent with previous OECD initiatives because we may have, for instance, IP box regimes that are taxed under the top-up tax, and I mentioned here that it's inspired in the QBIET under the GILT rule, but it's more broad because it includes natural resources and leasing. Here is something, a paper that Professor Schwedi wrote first with Pedro Schwedi and then we in Bulletin for International Taxation, mentioning this change in the Pillar 2 project because it was first focused on tax competition in general, and then with the inclusion of the SBIE deduction, it's more focused on harmful tax competition, but in an imperfect way, as I mentioned before, nothing really relevant for us to discuss. And here, the main points of criticism, and the first is that it's not a suitable proxy for the calculation of routine economic return, and I suggested here different alternatives that we may discuss if you want, like adjusted return on the total net corporate capital, routine return based on transfer pricing, or limited return by sector adjusted by jurisdiction, like the capital risk adjustment. Here is something that we didn't discuss. It's a point that is debated under the guilt that it may stimulate foreign assets investment and job creation abroad. So basically the idea is that companies can lower their net global income by investing in tangible assets and hire employees in other countries.
And duty is even more because it was when it was done just by one country without the perspective of the MTTs and anybody doing anything else, and it's a global blending, right? It's not jurisdictional blending like we have on Globe. So I think that's one point that we should explore. I mean, how developed countries look at this. Well, what I'm saying is that the more assets you have abroad and the more people you put abroad, the more you can get away with using tax incentives, or in that jurisdiction with jurisdictional blending, you can use putting more people and more assets there, even if it's less efficient than putting somewhere else, just to, yeah, exactly. And if let's bring the jobs back home, and let's bring the investments back home, it's something kind of contradictory. So
Totally, yeah, it is totally the contradictory. But I mean, why is that? Why can a politician say those things and it makes sense? Do you think?
why can they do it?
Yeah.
Well, if you look back at Trump, I think nobody really looked. I mean, his audience didn't know what Guilty was doing, and they didn't read the papers and anything. So, I mean, they can get away just with that because it's all on discourse.
Okay, so I think my answer to my own question is when Trump was in his first term, he fought with Macron about the DST, and he said, "You guys are not allowed to tax our companies." Well, Google might be based in America, but who? I mean, the idea, like if you sat down, you said, "Okay, but is Google operating in every country on earth?" Yes. Is our local advertisers who used to be advertising in local newspapers and on local radio stations, are they no longer doing that because they are advertising on Facebook and Google? Yes. So do you have an interest in understanding that Google is not one country's taxpayer? It is a global taxpayer. Yes, but this is a level of comprehension that is far beyond the average Trump voter for sure, and is probably far beyond the average American or even just normal, person. So this, the guilty, first of all, the name guilty is the same idea as the name FATCA. While the US is actively becoming the world's safest place for criminal proceeds, it says anybody who has money in an account outside of the US is a fat cat. That's where FATCA, that's the word. It's the fat cats who have their money overseas. And guilty is like, if you're not investing in the US, you're investing abroad, you're guilty. However, we need foreign capital. In the US, we need foreign capital we need Chinese people to buy American debt. We need foreign companies on the US exchange. So there's some, I think, universal truths in tax. Every country wants to get as much capital coming in and keep as much of their capital from going out, right? So they get all the capital from the world coming in and keep their own domestic capital in also. And the only way you can do that is if you somehow don't let no one else can see you doing that. Because if every country has that incentive, then obviously they're going to do all kinds of things that protect local industries but also make it possible for investment. Well, that's just not, you can't make a world where everybody is protecting local industry from outside and also bringing in capital. You cannot do it. So the whole structure of this, what is guilty actually getting at? Guilty is getting at exactly what we were talking about, is like what Brazil is doing. The US is emulating Brazil because the CFC rules were only attacking foreign passive investment. That's what the US CFC, they were leaving active income on the theory that if you are really going overseas, we want American businesses to grow. We want our national champions to become international champions. So we want them to go in these other countries. And actually, thank you if you don't tax them. Please please don't tax our American companies when they come here. And then one day they were like, well, wait a minute. But they're getting all of this intangible profit is being put in other places because we made this system. Now we want it back. And if they had just done what Brazil did from the beginning, which is tax everything on a worldwide basis, then you wouldn't have this problem. You wouldn't have the incentive to move offshore, and you wouldn't have a very bespoke, difficult to understand, but clearly politically loaded attempt to bring it back.
To say yes, but you would not have multinational US multinationals competing. That's it. Because you see, Brazil is the 8th or 10th economy in the world. How many Brazilian companies have you seen in your experience?
One, and if I say it, you
You see 1, 2, 3, 5, 6. I mean, this shows how bad our policy is.
Yeah, but Canada only has one company on the DST list, and that's a little company called Shopify. Okay, don't underestimate that it's not your local policies that did that, right? Because when I know, but when you have to go back to when e-commerce was new, and what did they do? They went to Ottawa. The countries went to Ottawa and they agreed on a moratorium. We're not going to tax e-commerce. That slammed the door on everybody except for the leaders. And who was the leaders? It was the US. Now the US made the world safe for digital companies to never pay any tax anywhere. So are we shocked that all the big digital companies are American? They had a huge advantage, and everyone else was like, but we'll have champions too. Canada agreed to it because we had BlackBerry. Remember BlackBerry? BlackBerry went up, 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 and then iPhone invented, and then BlackBerry dropped into the ocean, and we are still giving BlackBerry money. Canada is still handing them money. Like they get remission orders. They get like money because they are so sad as a company. They're not allowed to go back. They're not allowed to go bankrupt. Okay, so I just think, yes, I understand. Of course, if you are too protectionist, that is why the WTO started, because countries thought that open borders on the whole, Ricardian economics is better. It's better for all of us because the highest level, most efficient will, okay. But at the same time, the reality is each country is doing everything they can so that they are the champion, even if they're not. And when they get a foothold and you don't stop that foothold, you get Google, Facebook, Amazon eating everybody else's lunch and nothing you can do about it. And then the US can actually do this and it makes sense to them. And we all said like, oh yes, yes, yes. Guilty. Guilty as charged. You disagree with me yet?
But I have a follow-up question on your comment. Don't you think that from the US perspective, it would make sense if we consider the deferral in the past and then permanently reinvested the profits and the check the box rules so they can have a kind of a deduction for profits that have been reinvested in intangible assets and employees? And under the pillar two rule, it's a completely different scenario because we don't have like this previous experience. It's a completely new regime.
Well, I mean, I think it makes sense that the compromise after the Kennedy proposal for me is the worst compromise that they could reach, because you of course I do agree with Shueri, and we have to agree on something that that the full capital sport neutrality thing is a huge mistake, and you won't. I don't like national champions policy, especially the Brazilian ones. But I do think that if you want to have competitive multinationals, you cannot have full capital sport neutrality, especially if you have a high nominal rate. So I think that's one thing, and I think that was perceived very early in the game in the US. And the Kennedy proposal, that the whole active income part came out, and then you're stuck with CFC rules. But the problem was you're stuck with the furrow, and then you are really, really incentivizing people to put and reinvest the profits abroad, and you cannot reinvest it in passive income. So let's open another factory abroad. So that was really worse than the guilty regime. But the problem is, if you're gonna migrate to a territoriality system with CFC rules for passive income, which is very much okay, because then you need capital export neutrality to that. But are you gonna want to have a bite of some of the active income or not? And I can understand that if you want to have a bite, but if you want to have a bite, you're gonna do it this way, like saying, well, I will have a bite if you don't move your assets and your people abroad. But if you do move your assets and your people abroad, then I'm not gonna bite you. Well, that's a weird way to do it, and they kind of did it just for show because of the whole foreign tax credit and the half rate and the whole when this thing sunsets, and then I don't know how it's gonna be, but I think that it was more a marketing guilty thing, and to say, well, we're gonna bite you if you're shifting profits, but they didn't. And especially you see that the whole the whole thing was made to avoid taxing these profits and allowing American multinationals thrive. And when BEPS came along, they didn't like it, because that meant this moving assets and moving stuff to Ireland or to whatever place in Europe, and they didn't want to do that. They wanted them to stay in California. So I think this is kind of contradictory with that, and especially when you look at what happened with Apple in the European Union when the Commission said, Ireland, you need to tax them. They said, hey, come on, we are allowing this profit to be shifted to Ireland. Granted that they don't tax it, because it's, everybody knows that this is Californian profit and not Irish profit. So if they're gonna tax it, then come on, we need to review our relationship here, because I'm looking the other way, as long as you're doing it too, and we are allowing multinationals to have that profit there. So I think guilty is kind of contradictory in that point. And SPIE is a little bit different, although it may be guilty expired in some sort, but it's a little bit different on how it will play out, especially when you're looking at only jurisdictional blending and you're looking at everybody doing it. And I you know that I look at Pillar 2 as, you know, the world has reached an agreement on capital import neutrality to active income, but capital import neutrality will implode if we do allow everybody to do what they want and to drive ETR lower and lower and lower. And there's a case to be made by that. And then if you look at our federation and our state level tax, it imploded because of tax competition. So capping tax competition is a way to allow capital import neutrality to survive up to a certain extent. If it starts imploding, then you trigger a non-switch on capital export neutrality, which is the RR. And if there's people not willing to do that, then there's the guy in the corner standing with a stick saying, I'm going to hit you in the head, which is UTPR. So, you know, that's the system. And it's paternalistic, of course, it's paternalistic. But again, we know that capital import neutrality probably would implode if we let everybody do whatever they want. So, I mean, that's the scenario, at least in my head.
Yeah, the next issue here is, sorry, how can I come back here? Yeah, this the jurisdictional blending. I think you have discussed this topic with Roberto, but from the perspective of the blend between high tax and low tax in the same jurisdiction. And here, I have a question where a country with a high infrastructure, for instance, if we have Amazon with a warehouse in a jurisdiction and it has another entity in the same jurisdiction that is a web service, so a digital company, the SBIE fully reduces the net global income due to high investments in tangible assets. So the jurisdictional blend may allow countries to play when they have high infrastructure and may allow these countries to attract intellectual capital and other activities. On the other hand, country B, if it's a low infrastructure jurisdiction, so it will not have the same room to play with the jurisdictional blending, and will be more difficult to attract sophisticated activities. It's not really a question about developed country versus developing country. In general, developed country, you have more infrastructure and as a consequence, more room to attract target activities. But we may have developing countries like Brazil with a huge infrastructure because of the size of the country and other factors that may use the jurisdictional blending to make this blend between activities and use the SBIE to attract activities. Any comments on that? Yeah.
It's a bad thing overall, but for Brazil, it will play out nice.
Here is just the absence of carry forward and carry back, and it shows that it's not, it's something akin to the idea of taxing economic rents, but it's not identical because the absence of carry forward, it's not a full deduction of the opportunity cost of capital and the lack of intangibles. I think we have covered that. And then here we have some practical issues. Basically, you have an annual election, so the MNE may opt to not use the SPI carve-out, mainly if the costs for compiling the information to determine the exclusion are higher than the possible tax saving. It's also relevant as a safe harbor for routine profits, and it's also a tiebreaker for dual residence entities. So it's a residual tiebreaker. First, we have to apply the treaty criterion if there is a treaty in place between the two resident states. But then if there's no treaty in place, we will look to the jurisdiction where we have the higher amount of covered tax. And if it's not the case, then we go to the SBIE exclusion as a tiebreaker. Here just some...
I just don't remember. In the new treaty now you have SBIE as a tiebreaker.
No, it's a specific tiebreaker for the Pillar 2 when you have dual residence and you have to determine what is the residence country of that entity, not for treaties. I think nothing relevant here.
like to have a little discussion here. So one of the things I always think about with SBIE is if I had a major multinational, what you don't want is to be earning less than 5%. Like if your max is 5%, you need to move things around to get your 5% exclusion rate, right? So how much after the fact reorganizing can you do to like make sure that you don't have just like a little over 5% here and a little under there? Well, I just need to move one person. If only that one person had been there, or if only we could say that one person had been there, or you know what I mean? I wonder.
I have a related one. And this one regards the rule, and I don't have the rules in my mind. But how do you allocate payroll? Do you need to do you have like a transfer pricing? So I can allocate somebody being paid by a unit of the group, but actually is working for a project that is being that benefits the other unit. Do you have any rule for allocating? Because I do remember the UTPR rule to determine who gets the UTPR is a head count, and whoever is paying that guy gets the full thing. You don't really care, but you don't really care in the first place who gets the UTPR as long as somebody gets it. Here it's different, but I really don't remember the allocation rule.
I think there are two aspects to be considered. First is the dedication of the employee to a company in the jurisdiction. So the employee must work under direction and control of the entity in the country and in the operating activities of the country. And then we have the idea of the dedication time. So the employee must, if the employee has more than 50% of his time available dedicated to that jurisdiction, the full payroll cost can be considered. And if it's less, you have a apportionment based on the time. And then in relation to your question, I think a possible answer to that is we can see in the commentaries about stock compensation, because it mentions that if you have the parent company granting stock options to an employee of the local entity, a subsidiary in another jurisdiction, you need to have a recharge mechanism to bring it back to the payroll of this jurisdiction. So in addition to the time dedication, you need to have the actual payment of the compensation by the entity in the jurisdiction.
You can imagine, right, that if you have enough precision in your, like Walmart knows exactly which widget got taken off the shelf, exactly which one, right? So if you have that much precision, like if you go back one slide to this, see that full, more than 50% dedication. Well, dedication is qualitative, not quantitative, right? I mean, more 50% is quantitative, but the word dedication is what does it mean? And so if I could get myself down to like, if I'm talking about, just a little shift here, a little shift there to kind of average things out, I'm going to start doing that, right? I don't know, but it just like as you say on the other slide about the compliance costs, like can we just have a safe harbor and not worry about this? I don't know what the likely stance is of your standard multinational that would be in this position. Do they have enough control over that to just move people around? And my sense is they probably do. They probably do.
I'm trying to think here, but I haven't completed here. But you would attract every time you attract, you reduce your ETR anyway, because then you have more expenses. On the other hand, you get. I mean, I'm trying to see whether it's a good or bad business for you, because every employee means an expense. So just I'm trying to make the count.
Yeah. So it's a great example. So let's think of an example. So the free zone, the SCZ that we were talking about, you will have a zone where the local workers are leaving the country when they enter the zone. Okay. And so depending on how many people you have there working, this is going into your calculation, right? Now you have either a shortfall or you have too much. Like you have either your workers are extremely productive because you're not paying them very much, or they're not. So what I can do is tomorrow on the next container ship, just bring some more humans if I need more. Just bring some more from somewhere else and have them do that work there.
You don't reduce, you increase. You're changing the denominator. Come on, if you attract a worker, yes, your denominator is your profit is reducing, your tax is the same, so your ATR is going higher, and you double it down because you win in SBIE. So if I'm having extra normal profits in one jurisdiction, if I bring workers, I reduce my globe profit and I increase my SBIE. So I win twice.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to get at. You said it better than I did. Thank you for that. So this is built-in capacity already in the SCZ. Like this is common practice that American manufacturer will have a factory in the SCZ. They're hiring the local workers, but if they need somebody, they just bring them the next day and they just fill it in from America. So now you have not even local workers working in the SCZ. You wonder what you've given it for. There, this happened in I think it was Colombia. I think it was Colombia, where they had set it up, and it was Chinese factories hiring Colombians, and then they just started busing, not a bus, obviously. They brought them on the ship, but they came in bus loads of Chinese workers in the free zone I think it's Colombia. I'd have to go back and check on that. And then people start saying, well, why are you doing that? So there's all kinds of stuff involved in this. But if you've got now a new incentive to just, well, I need to adjust just a little bit, and all I have to do is push some dedication. Yeah.
I was
So
just wondering because if you have this kind of situation here in Brazil, maybe this can be considered, I don't know, a reimbursement or a payment of CERC. And at the end of the day, you have to pay CG and you have to pay another taxes. And also, you have the 5% margin for transfer pricing purpose. So maybe it's not just allocate the employee to the other country. You have other tax consequences that, in the end of the day, cannot worth.
So I wanted to make the same point. So Hayden wrote an exceptional article about the strategic reactions of MNEs on Globus. And one of them was kind of moving things around and sheltering incomes on the CBIE. But I think in practice, because those are hard assets, it's actually hard to move things around. So that's one of the good things of this exclusion. If there are any good things, this is definitely one of good things. It's not so easy to move things around. And when you're sheltering financial income on SBIE, then you're risking this income having a marginal rate that is above 15%. So I think it's a strategic game. Of course, we're gonna get there with lots of time thinking about tax planning, but I think it's gonna take about maybe a couple of years or even more to refine the best strategies of how to do those things.
But it's not only about moving things around, because if a M&E has to buy a new asset or hire a new employee, it may choose to do it through a jurisdiction where it will maximize the benefit under the Pillar 2 rules. So although it's difficult to shift assets and sometimes it may be difficult to shift employees, I think the question remains. And in relation to the dedication time, the OECD and the commentaries do not mention about if you have to use timesheet or something similar to compute this dedication period. Well, we have discussed the stock-based compensation. It's basically the eligible payroll cost. I think there's nothing to be debated here. In relation to tangible assets, the idea is to have a broad list to level the playing field across different industries. So if we have companies in different sectors that may use different types of assets. All the assets, tangible assets, are covered, and it doesn't matter for this purpose if the company owns the assets or if it has the right to use. The idea is that if the asset is used for substantial economic activity, it give rise to the carve-out exclusion. There is specific rules to deal with financial lease versus operating lease, but I think what is important here is that the right to use must be recognized in the financial accounts, like in the IFRS 16. So the OECD expressly mentions that if it's not in the financial accounts, you cannot create a hypothetical right of use to claim the SBIE deduction. And this may be relevant for short-term lease and also for a lease with in which the material value is low. Another important point from an accounting perspective is that if we have tangible assets recognized as intangible assets because they are related to public concessions, you can also claim the SBIE deduction. This is basically a negative list, and what is important to point out here is that assets held for sale, lease, or investment cannot be computed. So the idea is that MNEs could not claim a large carve-out by purchasing investment property because it's not assets directly or indirectly used in substantive economic activity. There is also a rule for the allocation of tangible assets. It's not so common to have the shift of tangible assets, but for instance, if a company in Brazil has an aircraft or an airplane and it spent part of its time in another jurisdiction, then you have to control the time in which the assets in Brazil or in other country.
Just one quick question. You might know that I don't have the rule in my head. If I put real estate rental activity in my as one of the activities that I do, and if I buy property for rental and I rent it, would that be counted? Because that's one way for me. Yeah, because usually rental income, if you look at Brazil, it unless you take the valuation of the property into account, rental income is lower than interest rates. So you would be able to shelter some of your income with that. Depending, I need to have the calculations to see if it would work. But I would try to shelter. My point is the buying of the asset might not be a good investment on itself to use it for rental, but because I have an SBIE, a bigger SBIE, it might be worth it to just shelter global income. So it would be an inefficient investment that becomes a good investment only for tax purposes. I don't know if the numbers would play out, but.
Just add to that. Yeah, exactly. So I'm thinking what I would do is, of course, I'm going to have my leasing arm that's going to own all the property and it's going to set the rent for all of the ones that are paying the rent. And now I'm going to start changing those numbers to get into whichever, yeah,
Within a jurisdiction or
across, in or across. I mean, within doesn't help, but I mean, like this is the Walmart school of this you try because some states had a lower tax on real estate than others, rental than others. Walmart transfer priced all leasing to a state that didn't tax, and then you have a transfer pricing internal. Okay. But here I'm talking if in your group you have the yeah, that's what I'm wondering. Yeah, just
two things. Of course, again, we have to look at the withholding tax to see if it would become a barrier or not. And other thing, depending on the lease that you do, if the asset's going to be computed in your entity or not. So, but yeah.
Yeah, there is a rule saying that if you have like a financial lease, only the leasing company and not the lessor can deduct the SBI to avoid the duplication. And for operating lease, there is a split mechanism. So in order to avoid the duplication again. And in relation to your question, the rules only make reference to investment property under the accounting rules. So In your example, would it be investment property or no? It's for accounting purpose. Yeah. Yeah. So it would not claim this case.
I need to look at the rule again, but I am pretty sure that if you're holding property for rental, it might be qualified as an investment property. So yeah, you might have.
There might be a solution, yeah. Here, there is another point because when they are explaining the carrying value of tangible assets, it mentions that it's net of accumulated depreciation, amortization, or depletion, and the commentaries include impairment loss, saying that it must also be considered for the determining the carrying value. And we may have a debate about the reverse influence of Pillar 2 on accounting because it may, for instance, disencourage impairment test, or it may stimulate the capitalization of interest expenses, because if you deduct the interest expense, you reduce your ETR, but if you capitalize it, it will maximize your SBI deduction.
Yeah, exactly. You definitely try to elect for fair value. If fair value, of course, you've expected to increase, and if you get that's going to take into account. And you might have the exact opposite effect on impairment. Of course, that is something that would be hard. But if you look at our goodwill rules, you can amortize in 5 years. It's not a tangible asset, so it's subject to recapture. The recapture say that if you don't recapture in 5 years, then you put it in the rule. But the question would be, if I impair this thing in 5 years, then I'm good to go. So I can keep my M&A incentive if I do impairment in 5 years. Of course, to justify a 5-year impairment of goodwill, it may not be that easy, but the question remains, would that I don't know, incentivize companies to rethink what they do in impairment right now? Because what they do in impairment right now is wrong also. Nobody impairs anything, especially in goodwill. You have companies that surely should have already impaired all their goodwill, that their book value is 3 times their market value, and you look at the goodwill is half of the book value is there, so it probably should be impaired, and they didn't. So it's interesting to see how will this thing put accounting in check or jeopardize the freedom of thought on accounting because you want to reduce your global impact.
I have seen impairment of goodwill in case of natural disaster, so it would it affected the profitability, and then they did impairment. Yeah, and the last slide was about the constitutional issues, but we have debated that where tangible assets is a proxy for the company size and whether payroll is a proxy for intensive use of labor. I think we debated that with Leonardo. That was basically that.
All right, Shweta, can we go more? How are you? Okay. Awesome. Do you need to be there? Yes. Oh,
The students are supposed to be
I want to know if anybody has a follow-up question. Anybody online has a question or a comment? All right. Two things. I made notes, but and I made my notes, but my notes are gone. So a couple of things. One, the withholding tax and DST thing, they're not the same. Come on. I mean, we don't catch with our withholding tax half of the income that a DST would catch. I mean, the
We have withholding tax on services. And the question is, DST could be more than services. It can be, no, this is the issue, not?
because DST allocates to the user country. So and withholding tax allocates to the payor country. And most of the income made from Brazilian users don't come from Brazilian source of payment. We are only source of production because the source of production is the human being that is giving the information. And withholding tax doesn't catch that. So you're targeting an ad to a Brazilian user who's going to buy something, but the payment for that ad is being made by a foreign corporation to another foreign corporation. DST might catch that. Even the digital permanent establishment rules might catch that.
Maybe I'm not aware that DST catches if there's no cash flow. From what I know, DST depends on the cash flow.
That's the guy regardless. How am I going to enforce it?
Here, let's get the.
It attracts. Yes, it attracts the user, not the cash flow. We wrote about that.
But
I know. I don't.
but with no cash flow, how can you
DST is hard.
Yeah,
The enforceability is tough, but it's meant to do that.
but the enforceability of withholding taxes in Brazil is tough because we
Well, but withholding tax, you
Real-
have the money here. But I mean, what
But
what
you don't
people,
enforce it, Vittori, in
Hmm?
practice, because we use all these EFX agents when you're hiring most of the online services nowadays.
what they
There's
say
no
for this,
enforcement.
what they say for DST is if you have assets here, we'll seize your assets, and if you don't have assets here, I've seen people proposing that. And to make it clear, I'm not proposing this, but we'll shut down the internet for you. Because screw internet neutrality, and we'll just put a firewall, and that's how they're going to enforce it. But it's not contingent on payment. It's a revenue threshold, but it's a user allocation. I tax the revenue, but I allocate by user base. But it's not local revenue. It's not local payment. So, I mean, the DST is attracting something completely different than a base that which withholding tax is catching. And of course, in my mind, it's trying to grab what is supposed to be grabbed with source of production, which is much more relevant than source of payment, but it's doing it the wrong way, of course. Well, I mean, the European proposal was like that. Yeah, so it's been a while, Shweti, but if you look at the blueprint for that thing, that's the way they wanted to do it. Am I wrong?
You're right. The way they are discussing the terms of reference in the UN is also kind of
So
similar to that.
So that's that. You get a completely different base, and you get something that withholding tax doesn't. And on the other hand, the withholding tax does things that are really detrimental for the country that imposes it that the DSC doesn't. Because the withholding tax is basically an import duty on services. And I know what you're going to say, the names. But because I'm taxing, especially ours, because I'm taxing active income on the gross amount, I'm not taxing income at all. I'm taxing gross revenue. And I'm imposing a tariff on the imports of services and technology. And it's non-creditable for the buyer. And if you have, like, if you're taxing the gross revenue at 25% and the margin of the guy there is 1% on their revenue, what they're going to do, they're going to shift it to the buyer. But why am I going to sell this thing on a profit? Oh, but they have foreign tax credit. I don't have a profit. I mean, my income tax is probably less than 20% of my 1% profit on the revenue. How much will credit be worth to me? Nothing. So what I'm going to do, I'm shifting everything to the buyer. So the buyer is paying the withholding tax. And then this is going to be into my cost of production. That guy that needs technology for agriculture and so on and so forth. So this is going to be into the cost of the Brazilian soy that is going to be exported. So we're putting our withholding tax on the cost of the Brazilian product that is going to be sold into the international market. So that's what the withholding tax is doing. And it's hampering, and it's increasing at a 25% the cost of services and technology. And they say, well, this is a good thing because we substitute for Brazilian services and technology. How the hell are you going to get Brazilian technology if you're not allowed to use foreign technology to produce it? So that's the real poor developing country story that we have. We cannot develop. You cannot have a, you know, if you look at the whole app market and what we can do, it's a reboot. Everybody can develop an app and become huge. But if you want to develop an app here, if you want to develop a game and you have a Brazilian company, you can. Because if you want to use a foreign service, you have a 25% tax on that. And the way the app market works is that you use ads. So you basically get ad revenue, and you have ads expenses. And you know, for each dollar that you spend on an ad for your game, if you have $1.01, you're winning big, but your margin is nothing. But when you're putting big numbers, then you're making a huge profit. But you know, if for every dollar that you pay for an ad and you're contracting a foreign ad network, you're gonna get 25% of withholding tax, then you're dead because your margin is much, much lower than that. What you're gonna do, you're gonna invert to Hong Kong or to whatever country that doesn't charge a withholding tax. So yeah, that's what's happening. I seen that happening. It's anecdotic, but it's real. So that's the withholding tax, and the DST doesn't do that. The DST is problematic in a whole different level, but it doesn't do that. It hurts less the country that's imposing it than withholding tax. And I'm not advocating for a DST, but you know, that's just a parenthesis. The other parenthesis that I wanted to make is again the words and what Trump said about the VAT. I mean, it's unreal in my opinion. But is it kind of trying to lay the ground again for another shot of the cash flow destination based income tax? So the Paul Ryan thing, because the what we cannot deny is that if you have on your tax mix a bigger mix of consumption taxes than income taxes, I'm gonna win in foreign trade, because consumption taxes are only levied in local consumptions, and it doesn't hamper production, because you're not taxing local production, you're not taxing allocation here. I have a lower income tax which does exactly that. So if I'm financing my own country with consumption taxes, I'm probably going to be able to attract more investments and win in foreign trade than a country that is financing on a real income tax, which is an income tax based on depreciation and so on and so forth. So if I look at the scenario, I either try a shift to VAT and lower my income tax, or I will lie and say that I have an income tax, but instead I'll have a consumption tax. And the way I do that is I do expensing, and I do it on a destination basis. So I don't allow a deduction for imports, and I exempt exports. Exempting export is a problem with the WTO, but I don't care about the WTO anymore. They might have cared for it at 2017, not that much, but still. But now I don't care for it. And probably under Pillar 2, on the definition of covered taxes, I might still get away of putting that thing as a covered tax. So is it just preparing a rhetoric to lay the ground for another step of that, or you think that that's not the case? Idiotic or really bright? I don't know. Well, you know, it's a whole new way to do foreign policy, and so yeah, or going back to the old ways. Yeah. Nobody has any other question, anything to add? So I want to really thank you, Alison, again for coming here and to staying for the debate, and thank all the students for the whole course. This was a project that we dedicated a lot of time to put it together, and it was within a grant again, and we had a real responsibility to making it worthwhile and to do the whole internationalization purpose of the grant. And Shweti, I think we have succeeded, so we're very proud of it. And I want to thank you, Shweti, for getting on the boat with me.
My point. I must thank Gustavo. It's obvious that who prepared the whole course and so on was Gustavo. He did it, made a huge effort on this. I'm here just being here and the idea that you're there, and then suddenly you have Gustavo preparing everything, working a lot on this, and I saw your effort. Congratulations for what you did. I think that all the students, we must, of course, now thank Ellison and Ramon for today. But I would ask all students to say thank you to Gustavo. So for us, it's over. For you, not. Tomorrow you have exam. So